Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Good evening, welcome everybody to another DevOps Playground event here at Global Logic in Manchester. My name's Andy Lawless, I'm the DevOps lead for the Product Engineering Centre here in the UK. The DevOps Playground is a community-based event sponsored by Global Logic, where we go through demonstrations around various tools and technologies where you can follow along and hopefully learn something cool. So without further ado, I will hand over to Alicia, who is going to take us through an intro to React Server components using Next.js. Thank you.
Well, hello everyone. My name is Alicia, like Andy says, and today we will talk about React Server components in the context of Next.js. Now, in the next hour, I do not aim to provide you with a detailed overview of how Next.js works, and instead we'll be looking at some of the trends that front-end development seems to be moving towards. And one of these trends is the trend of shifting more and more logic away from the browser and the client and onto the server. And this aims to solve some of the common issues in web development, like slow load times and search engine optimization concerns. And we will have a look at both of those in a moment. But some may say that React is moving towards becoming a full-stack framework. So whereas traditionally we would have two separate projects, one project will deal with the front end and it would probably be built in React, and a separate project will deal with the back end and it would probably be built in Node and Express. With the rise of React Server components, there appears to be an appetite to merge these two together. And this is because React Server components allow us to run server-side code in React, which in turn allows us to do things like read files from a file system or connect to a database and retrieve data from a database without using an API. And we will have a look at both of those things later this evening. So I would like to kick off by having a look at how a traditional React application works under the hood. And when I talk about a traditional React application, I'm referring to a React application that is just rendered on the client in the browser. So it's in no way pre-rendered on the server. And in order to review how a traditional React application works, I want to have a look at a very specific period of time during the traditional React application lifecycle. And that is what happens in between the time of me entering a URL into the browser address bar and me seeing some useful content on the page. And in order to review this React application in this way, I went ahead and I created a very simple React application for us to have a look at right now. So here is the React application, sorry, this one here. And it is a very simple application. All you really need to know about it is that it fetches some information from a backend server, and then it renders that information on the page. And it also has some routing in it. So we are currently looking at the landing page, and the landing page displays all of the featured events. But I can navigate to an all events page, which displays all of the events that I have fetched from the backend. I also have the option to filter the events based on the date. And I have the option to navigate to a new page which will display more information about this event. So the application is really, really simple and it's quite static. And remember, we want to investigate what happens in between the time of me entering this URL into this browser and me seeing this content on the page. So to do that, I'm going to go into my DevTools. And I'm going to go into the Network tab. And the Network tab will present me with a request log. And this request log shows me all of the requests that my browser has made between the time of me entering that URL and me seeing some useful content on the page. And there are two requests in particular that we are interested in. The first request that we're going to have a look at is this root request to my local running server called localhost. And if we investigate this request, we can see that we got some HTML back. But if we have a closer look, we can see that this HTML isn't very detailed. There's barely any content in it. There's more comments than actual code. So if I look in this body tag in particular, I can see that I've got a div here. And this is a very important div because that is where the browser will eventually render the React application. But for the time being, or at the time that this HTML is fetched by my browser, that application is not there. And we also have this head tag right here. And it contains some metadata. But importantly, it contains this script tag right here. And this script tag is very important because it tells my browser that in order for it to display this content, it needs to go off and fetch some JavaScript. So this is what my browser goes on and does. It goes back to the server and it requests that bundle.js. And we can see that that bundle.js contains a lot of code. In fact, I scrolled all the way down earlier and it was just under 34,000 lines of code. And this bundle.js contains all of the JavaScript that my browser needs to render the React application. Then if we have a look further down, we can see that I've got some JSON files here. These JSON files is the data that I fetched from the backend once this React application has been rendered by the browser. So if I were to put this into a flow diagram, sorry, I seem to be lagging. Oh, here we are, sorry. It would look something like this. I enter the URL into my browser's address bar. My browser goes off and requests that HTML. There's a pause whilst that HTML is being fetched. That HTML then tells my browser, go and fetch that JavaScript. There's another pause whilst that JavaScript file is being fetched. Once we receive that JavaScript file, my browser is then able to render that React application. And it goes back, and it goes to that backend, and it fetches that data, so there's another pause. And only upon that third fetch is some useful content visible to the user. And you should already be seeing a problem with this approach. Clearly, it is not the most efficient way of rendering a page because we have to make 3 separate requests before any useful content becomes available to the user. And this becomes even worse when we start to think about how a traditional React application or how client-side rendering happens in React. Because if we have a look at the code, this is the code that is responsible for rendering that homepage that I showed you earlier. We can see that in React, we use useEffect in order to fetch data. But anyone who has ever worked with React will know that useEffect behaves in mysterious ways. Because you would think that when the browser is presented with this code, it will go to the top of the code and it will run that code line by line. But that is not what happens when you start using useEffect. What actually happens is that the browser goes to the top, it imports all of these things one by one, it hits that homepage component, it destructs that variable and that setter function from the useState hook, then it gets to the useEffect and it just skips it. So when we hit this if statement, it evaluates to true because at the time that featured events variable remains an empty array. And we return a loader. Once we have returned that loader, the browser goes back and finally executes that useEffect. So we are finally fetching that data that we want to display to the user. And once we have fetched that data, you can see that we are using the setter function to put that data inside of this variable, which means now when this if statement runs, it evaluates the false, and then we are finally rendering the key data that we want our users to see. But the reason why I'm highlighting this is to show that it takes at least 2 renders before any useful content becomes available on the page. And this is why, if you ever go to view a website that is built using traditional React, so it's rendered on the client, you will very often see these loader states. Because on the first render, we are only returning the loader, and it's only on the second render that we are returning that key information. And this, on top of the fact that we need to make those 3 separate requests, can have some serious implications in real life. Most obviously, it increases the load time of the application. And this is particularly problematic for a retailer who wants to make sure that a page is loaded as quickly as possible. And this is because there has been countless amount of research produced by big retailers like Amazon, which has shown that loading up a page as quickly as possible leads to better conversion rates. But another problem with traditional React applications is that they lead to search engine optimization concerns. And to understand why this is a problem, it is useful to think back to the HTML that we are receiving on that first request. And if I go back and have a look at it again, you can see that this HTML doesn't have much information in it. Crucially, it doesn't have all of this key data that I would have hoped would be visible to a search engine crawlers. So it doesn't contain the titles, the location, the presenters, the date of my event. And this means that this data is not visible to search engine crawlers. And this is going to be a particularly big problem for any public-facing page that we want to make sure is easily found through search engines like Google. So both of these issues, the issue of the slow load time and this surge in optimization concern, both of these suggest that if we had a way of pre-generating that HTML on the server, and if we had a way of fetching data on the server and then injecting that data into that pre-generated HTML, then both of these problems would be solved to an extent. Because it means that as soon as we make that one single fetch, sorry, I'm just going to change slides, because it would look something like this. As soon as we make that request for HTML, our user will have something useful to look at. And this is because our local server would receive that request. It would fetch any data that is required. It would then load up that React application, and any JSX that this React application returns at that point in time would be used to pre-generate that HTML. And that HTML, which would include that key data that has already been fetched, would be then sent back to our browser. And like I say, after just one single request, our user would have some useful content to look at, and our search crawlers would have useful context to work with. So this is sort of what server-side rendering is about. And by using server-side rendering, or to be more specific, static pre-generation, and React server-side component, we can try and solve both of these problems that I've just mentioned a moment ago. So in this next part, we will try and turn the traditional React application that I just showed you from being rendered on the client to being rendered on the server. But before I do that, I want to quickly show you the application that we will be working with, because it's not exactly the same application. So this is the application that all of us will be working on today. And it pretty much looks identical to the React application that I showed you earlier. In fact, if we compare the two, they look very, very similar. And this is because I have pretty much copied and pasted the code from that original React application into a new project that uses Next.js. I obviously had to make some changes to make sure that the original React code runs in Next.js. And in particular, I had to change some of the routing because routing is handled slightly differently in Next.js than it is in traditional React. But other than that, I left everything the same. So given this, if we now investigate what happens under the hood, so what happens in between the time of me entering that URL into the browser address bar and me seeing this content on the page, we'll see that the request looks pretty similar. So we still have that root request to our local host, our local server. But if I click to see what the HTML that we are getting back looks like right now, you can see it comes back in a single line, so I'm just going to paste it into VS Code so that we can read it. Sorry, this is slightly lagging. I am scrolling up. So we can see that the HTML is a little bit more detailed. If I scroll down to the body, you can see that I am now getting the nav bar inside of the body. And if I scroll down further, sorry, it really is lagging. I am scrolling, I promise. You can see that I'm getting the loader as well. And the reason why this HTML looks slightly different now than it did in the traditional React application that we looked at, is because Next.js by default pre-generated this page. But importantly, I am still not getting that key data that I want. So I'm not getting the information about my events, like the titles, the dates, the locations. And this is because of what I said just a moment ago. I pretty much copied and pasted the code from the traditional React application into a project that uses Next.js. And this means that we are still fetching that key data on the client side. And if I were to put this into a flow diagram, it would look something like this. I enter the URL into my browser goes off and requests that HTML. My local server receives that request. My local server then spins up the React application. And whatever JSX it returns at that time, it is used to pre-render that HTML, which is then sent back to my browser. But remember that if statement which said that if this data hasn't been fetched yet, just return that loader. That is all that this React application is rendering at the moment because that data hasn't been fetched yet. So that's why we saw that loader inside of the HTML. And then once we receive the HTML, my browser still goes off and it fetches that JavaScript file, it spins up or boots up that React application, and then that application finally goes off and fetches that key information about my application. So we haven't really solved the problem yet because the search crawlers as it stands can only see that loader and the navbar, which isn't really helpful. And our user still has to wait for 3 separate requests before any useful content becomes available on the page. So what we really want is something that looks a little bit more like this. So again, we want to enter that URL into a browser address bar. We want our browser to send off a request for that HTML. We want our local server to receive that request, and then as soon as it receives that request, we want it to have the capability to go off and fetch that data from the backend. And once that data has been fetched, We want our local server to spin up the React application with that data already there. And then whatever JSX that application returns, we want to use it to pre-generate that HTML, which we can then send back to the browser. And this means that at that stage, that HTML is detailed, it has all the key information, our search crawlers are happy, a user is happy upon that first request, they can see something useful. But then after that, our browser still goes off and fetches the JavaScript, it still goes off and spins up that React application and might fetch some further information, some further data from the backend. But however long it takes, it doesn't really matter anymore because the load time is over. Our user already has some useful content to look at, and our search crawlers have a lot of context to work with. So that is where we want to be. And we can use React server components to fetch that data on the server before we pre-generate that HTML. Cool, so we're gonna do some coding now. But before we can do any coding, we need to set up our infrastructure. So can everyone get laptops out if you haven't already? And can everyone navigate to this link at the very top? So that's lab.devopsplayground.org.
Oh, what's the Wi-Fi, guys?
I don't know.
Wi-Fi password. Yeah, I've got two here, I'll pass them around. Yeah. Sorry, that's on us. Do you guys need a Wi-Fi card, anybody? Yeah. Yeah. I'm not a developer, so. Yeah. We're both going to be, yeah. We're both going to be stuck as it is.
Tom, is my mic back on?
Your mic's back on, everyone can hear you, yeah. What's the lab? Have we got any comments on YouTube for passwords? This is the hardest part. We can hear the setup.
Right. Has everyone got the Wi-Fi up and running? It's, yeah, it's at the top here. I don't know if you can see that. Do you want me to make it bigger? No worries. Huh? Yeah.
You didn't do registration on the meal.
I did the meetup.
Yeah.
The email thing, right?
No, just the username of your meetup app.
Yeah, so for the username, so if you once you navigate it to this page, you will see that you need the username to log in. Your username is going to be whatever username you have on Meetup. So I believe everyone here used Meetup to sign up for this event. So whatever your username is there is going to be the username you'll be using today. So in my case, you can see my Meetup profile here. For me, it would be just my name and my surname, and that would be my username. Yeah.
Oh yeah. It would have picked up the whole thing. Yeah.
So, for those of you who are ready, if you press submit, you should see this information pop up. Is everyone ready to move on? Yeah. So the first link that we're going to use is the one at the very bottom, and it's a terminal link. So if we paste that into a new tab, it should bring you to this page, which looks like a terminal. Is everyone there? Is everyone looking at something that looks like this? The password that we need to enter is Next23 with a capital N. So that's Next23 with a capital N. And if you enter the password successfully, you should see a message that looks like that. Now, for this next bit, there are a number of commands that we need to execute to get our application up and running. So I'm just going to go to the repo of the application that we're going to be working on, and all of you have access to this repo. And there we have step-by-step guidance on how to set up this infrastructure. So I'm just going to pull it side by side so we can look at both at once. And you can see that in step 7, which is where we are currently, you can see that the first command that we have to enter is that we need to enter into this working directory. So it's cd work dir. Secondly, we need to enter into the repo which has already been cloned for us. So if you enter cd and then capital D, if you click the tab button, it should automatically finish that command for you, or else you can type it manually. No worries.
I don't know if everyone has access to the Git repo.
What do you want?
No one has access to the Git repo.
No, the Git repo is public. So if you want to access it through GitHub, you can.
A link to it.
Yeah. I don't know how to send the link.
Oh, okay.
It's the one, it's github.com/DevOps Playground /DPG.
I did it in the chat.
Oh, yeah.
Someone already done it.
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah, it's on the YouTube. If anyone needs the GitHub, it's on the YouTube. There's a link to it.
If you go on, if you just type in YouTube and then type in DevOps Playground in the search bar, you should see all of us live right now. But it won't see you, it will just be Alicia. And you can click one of the top links in the chat, and that will be the GitHub.
Can you imagine getting this one in there?
Yeah.
So which one?
Is it DevOps Live that you say on YouTube?
Just DevOps, DevOps Playground, sorry, and then the live video that's running now will be us in this room, but 10 seconds later.
Later.
Bye.
You just see the before.
So, I'm not sure if anyone is ready to roll.
Give it a minute.
I just got an error.
No worries. You've got an error on it.
Yeah, I'm
Just
fixing it. I think it's my own problem.
Just CD works here. Press enter.
Hey,
So
that's
get rid of that.
Yeah,
Got that?
Hold on.
Yeah.
Sweet, sweet.
Yeah.
What did the GitHub now, or is that the data?
It's more for the README, just to follow along.
Yeah, so the README inside of that repo contains step-by-step of everything that we are about to code. So if you get lost, just use the repo and catch up.
Yes, thank you.
it's just the top link. Yeah, like the top one equivalent. Oh, I can't see your mouse. Sorry. That one there, in the chat.
Oh, in the chat.
In the chat, right? Just the top one.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you click that, and then look at the README, and you'll be able to follow it out. No worries.
Right. So now we have our application running on the server, so we can access it through the browser. So we're going to do that now. So let's copy this link that we have for this terminal page. And if we open a new tab and copy that, paste that link in, but make sure you delete the wetty endpoint and replace it with 3001. Phil, is it /3001? Is it colon? Colon. Sorry guys, so the link that we need to have this application up and running is the same link here that we get on this page, except we are deleting wetty and /. So /wetty, get rid of it, and replace it with :3001. It's 3001. Yeah.
We're just catching up, Diana. Could you repeat that again?
So to get the link, you need to copy the link from the terminal page, but delete the /wetty and replace it with :3001. Sorry, I'm going to scroll down here.
They generate a new word from between every single person, so that each person has a different parts from the band. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I should have said that we all have slightly different links. So I seem to have Sweet Panda. Yours might say something else.
Yeah.
Something Panda, probably.
Yeah. It shows nothing. Yeah, it's just taking a while to load for me. But yeah, got anyway.
Cool, all good? Brill. So we also need to open our VS Code. And to do that, we're going to grab that other link that we have been provided with. And we're going to paste it into a new tab. Just make sure you have both of your terminal page and your application running. Don't close that ever. And then hopefully if you enter that IDE link into a new tab, it should bring up your VS Code, which might look slightly differently from mine. It might be light themed. Yeah, I asked the guys to change mine because I couldn't cope. Sorry.
If you want to change
You can change it in the settings, I'm sure.
Oh, you've done it. Oh, you've done it.
Okay, and then CD work period. And then CD page. Yeah, you just do that. Yeah, there you go. And npm.
So, does everyone have the VS Code up and running? Yeah? Cool, so once you have your VS Code up and running, can you navigate to that index.js file? So that index.js file lives inside of the pages folder at the root level. So once you find the pages folder, which lives at the root level of the application, there should be an index.js in there. Cool. So if you're looking at the right page, you should be looking at the home page component. Cool. Has everyone got this homepage component up?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So the first thing that we're going to do is we are going to change that homepage component so it fetches data from an API on the server using React Server Component, because remember at the moment it is fetching that data on the client. And we know that this component is fetching that data on the client because the data is fetched inside of this use effect and it's fetched inside of this homepage component. So in order to do that, we are going to use a React Server Component, because like I keep saying, React Server Components allow us to run server-side code in React. And this means that we need to have a way of telling Next.js, because remember we are now working with Next.js, we need to have a way of telling Next.js that the component that we are about to create has to be a React Server Component, and that component must run first before this component is run. Because inside of that React Server Component, we want to fetch data which we want to expose or pass to this homepage component. So chronologically speaking, that component must run first. And thankfully, because we are working with Next.js, setting up or creating a React Server Component is incredibly easy. If you did try to do that outside of Next.js, it is possible, but it is a pain. But because we are working with Next.js, there are a number of reserved words that we can use. And as soon as we use those words, Next.js will know that we are creating a React Server Component. And one of those reserved keywords is getStaticProps. Now, getStaticProps is a function, and it's an async function, so it returns a promise. And it also needs to be exported in order for Next.js to take notice of it. And getStaticProps allows us to pre-generate data statically at runtime. So any code that we run inside of getStaticProps will be run once at build time, sorry, not runtime, build time. So getStaticProps runs only at build time. There is a way for you to make sure that it runs again once this application has been deployed, and if you want to update your data, there is a way to ensure that this happens, but we're not going to look at that today. We're just going to be assuming that this getStaticProps runs once and it runs at build time only. So any code that I put inside of this component will run at build time, and in our case, we'll be fetching some data from it, or inside of it. And any data that I return from getStaticProps will be passed to this homepage component via props. So if I now return an object with a key of props, and that key of props is also going to have a nested object with featured events, I know that those featured events are going to be passed to this homepage component, because I know that this component is going to run first before this one is run. So once homepage component runs, I know that I already can grab and work with featured events, and I'm simply destructuring them right there. But of course, featured events at the moment are not defined. And like I keep saying, we just want to fetch those featured events from the backend. So I'm going to use the exact same API call and the exact same function that I used on the client. And I'm just going to pop it inside of getStaticProps. And I'm going to do that with a new variable as well. Featured events. Yeah. So now, once this getStaticProps function runs and my featured events are filled with whatever data I get back from the backend, I know that that data is going to be exposed to this component. So this means that I no longer need this use effect because I already have this data. I don't need to fetch it again. And this also means I no longer need this use state because I don't really have any state to manage. I already have this data. I probably don't even need this loader anymore because if the featured events come back as an empty array, I probably don't want to display a loader. I want to display an error message of some sort or telling the user that there is no data to see here. And this means that I can also get rid of those imports because I'm no longer using them. So now that I've made all of these changes, if I have a look at my application, you can see that it looks exactly the same as before, which is what we wanted. Except this time, the data that we are seeing on this page has been pre-generated on the server. It hasn't been rendered or grabbed by the browser. So now if we investigate what happens in between the time of me entering the SweetPanda URL and me seeing this content on the page, you will see that the request log looks pretty the same. So we still have that root request to our local running server, which is now called SweetPanda. But if we investigate the HTML, I'm just going to grab it and paste it inside of my VS Code again, just so we can read it. We can see that the HTML that we have received back from the server is a lot more detailed. And importantly, it contains all that key information that I want it to contain. This is lagging, that's why it's moving on its own. It contains that date, the event title, the location, and all of the other information that I would have hoped would be made visible to the search crawlers. So now we have achieved aim number 1, because we already fetched that data from the API using a React server component. So we're going to move on to aim number 2, which is we're going to read the data from a file system on the server using a React server component. Now for this bit, we are really utilizing the fact that React server components run on the server and they come with server-side capabilities. Because if I try to read a file from my local file system in a regular React component, then that will completely fail because my browser doesn't have access to my file system. In particular, my browser doesn't have access to all of the files that I have inside of my project. And this is because not all of these files are sent to my browser as part of that bundle.js that we saw before. But because we are working on the server, we can absolutely read our local files. So to do that, I'm just going to comment out the getStaticProps function that we worked with. Just because we're not going to use it anymore, and I'm also going to comment out the function we are no longer using. And I'm going to create a new getStaticProps component. And in order to read a file from my local file system, I will import fs from Node. And I'm going to import the promises version of fs because I know that I'm working with promises here because this is an async function. And fs is a Node module, and because we are working on the server, then obviously we can use all of the modules and objects that are made available to us in Node.
I'm sorry, I have an error here saying event dot map is not a function, and it's a different component within this.
If you have a look at the repo, you should be able to compare your code with what you wrote. Is anyone else getting errors? Do you want me to have a look? How's your work, Ahmed? Yeah. Are you destructuring on the home page?
No, they want to stop step before.
If you go into the GitHub repo, it should have step-by-step code.
Oh, right, okay. Okay, cool. No worries. I've done that many times, believe me.
Yeah, he was just looking at the step before when we reloaded it before.
Right, so we're going to read the file from our local file system. And like I said, to do that, I just imported this fs module from Node. And I'm going to use this fs module inside of getStaticProps. And I'm going to invoke it with this read file method. And on a bit of a side note, it is worth knowing that we are importing this fs module from Node, but this module is only ever used inside of a server component. And this means that this module will effectively be stripped from the bundle that is sent to the browser. So do you remember that bundle.js, which contains all of that code that our browser needs to render the React application? Obviously, because we are only using this module on the server, our browser doesn't need it in any way. And in fact, like I keep saying, if we did try to use fs inside of our regular React component, it's not going to work anyway. But it's just worth knowing that any modules that you use inside of server components are going to be stripped out of that bundle, which means we are shipping less code to the browser, which ultimately makes our application more efficient. So the read file method takes as an argument a path, and this path represents the path between my current working directory and the file that I am trying to read. And the file that we'll be reading lives inside of this data folder here, and it's called eventsdata.json. So all of you should have this file in your projects. And this JSON file contains exactly the same data that we previously fetched from the API, except for this data, I have added a little folder emoji next to the titles, just so we know that once we render this data on the browser, we know that that pre-generated data has been read from this file and not from the API. So if I go back to my index.js, like I say, I need to construct that path between my current working directory and that particular JSON file. So to help me do that, I'm going to import path from Node. This is another Node module, and it's another module that is not going to be included in that bundle.js because we only are using it inside of a server component. And I'm going to create a new variable called file path. And I'm going to use that path module and invoke it with a join method. Now, the join method, the first argument in this join method has to be our current working directory. So to grab my current working directory programmatically, I'm going to use the process object, and I'm going to invoke the current working directory method. The process object is a Node object. Yes, yet again, because we are working on the server, we have access to all of the Node objects and all of the Node modules. And the reason why I want to grab my current working directory programmatically in this way is because when Next.js will run this module, run this getStaticProps function at build time, remember, because it runs at build time, it will treat all of the pages inside of this pages folder as though they live on the root of the application. So as though they live on the same level as the rest of these files right here. So this means that if we want to construct a path between this getStaticProps and this JSON file, our next argument is going to be the data, which is representative of the data folder that we want to enter next. And once we are inside of this data folder right here, we can just enter and read that event data JSON. I'm just going to copy the name of this file because I cannot spell. So once we have this path constructed, we can make sure that it's being consumed by this read file method. So I'm just going to pop it in there. And I'm also going to create a new variable called JSON data. And I'm going to await this method's results, so to speak.
Do we need to have the extension for the event data JSON?
Oh yeah, we do, absolutely. Very well spotted. So once we have the data from the read file method, anyone who has ever worked with FS will know that it's going to come back in JSON format. So we're going to have to parse it into actual JavaScript. So I'm going to create a new variable called all events because I am grabbing all of the events from that JSON file. And I'm going to invoke, or I'm going to use the JSON object, which is universally available in both the the server and the client. And I'm going to pass the data that I received back. And once I have all of my events, I need to filter these events depending on whether or not they are featured events. And the reason for that is because if you think back to the application we are working on, that landing page only displays or renders the featured events, not all of the events. That's a separate page that we are not working on. So just to filter these events, I'm going to use the filter method. But first, I'm going to create the featured events variable. And I'm going to grab all of these events. And if we have a look at the data that we got back from this file, you can see that that data contains an array that's called events. So we just need to make sure that we are filtering that array and not the actual object. So to do that, I'm just going to do dot notation and events. And that's what I'm going to filter. Is that what the key is? Yeah. Is everyone familiar with the filter method? I think I might have misspelled, yeah. I really can't see. I need like grammar glasses to be able to do this. Can I zoom in? Yeah, brilliant. I should have done that at the beginning.
It's not too bad here, but it's more for you.
So once I have my featured events sitting inside of a variable that I can use, I'm going to return an object like before, which is going to have a key of props. And it's going to have a nested object with those featured events. And now if we go back to the homepage component, we don't really need to change anything there because we are destructuring featured events like before. So now if I go to my application, you will see that it looks similar to what we've seen before. The CSS seems to have changed for some reason. I don't know why. But we still have those featured events rendering on the page. And importantly, we have this folder emoji next to our titles, which shows that this pre-generated data has been read from that particular file. And again, if we go to our request log, and if we analyze the HTML that we've been sent back, oops. Again, I'm just going to paste it into VS Code so we can read it.
Can we see the last bit of
The last bit where you returned.
Yeah, sorry, I'm lagging. This is taking ages. You can go on the repo, Ahmed. Just use the repo. This is painful. He's lagging so bad.
I think the same thing happened with Grid as well. It's just a projection.
I think it's my laptop. He always does that. Yeah.
It's this one. Step 9.
So if we have a look at the HTML that we received back, it looks pretty identical to the one we got when we fetched that data from an API on the server, except now obviously we are getting those little folder emojis. And also, I haven't mentioned this yet, but if you scroll to the bottom of the HTML, I'm trying to do that right now. You can also see that at the very bottom of the HTML, we are getting that raw data that I have passed from the server into the homepage component, attach that HTML. And this data effectively helps React. So if you look back at the flow diagram that I showed earlier, once this HTML is fetched by the browser, we are still running React application later on. We are rendering it as normal. So this data helps React know what data has been pre-generated on the server. So then if you make any updates to this data, for example, React knows what data it has to work with. So it's just a bit of a side note. Cool, so now we have achieved aim number 2. So we're going to move to aim number 3, and this is where things get really interesting and a little controversial, some may say. So for aim number 3, we are going to fetch data directly from a database on the server using a React server component. So as you all know, originally we used an API, and an API is effectively an access point to an application that is capable of connecting to a database and retrieving information from that database and then passing that information back. But because we are already working on the server, we can skip the need to use an API and the need to use the application and instead go straight to the database, connect to it, and retrieve information from it. So we're going to try and do that right now. And I have already created a database for us to work with. And I'm using MongoDB Cloud that I'm going to sign into right now. And if we have a look at the data that I have already inputted into this database, you can see that it's pretty much the same data that we've been working with so far, but this time I have included a little bread emoji next to the title, just so we know that when we are rendering this page and we have this pre-generated data, we'll know that that data has been read directly from this database and not from the API or the file or whatever. And MongoDB Cloud is really good in giving us instructions on how to connect and establish connection. And we're going to be using the node drivers to connect. So there's a requirement that we have Node.js, which all of us already have installed. There's also a requirement that we install MongoDB as a dependency. Again, all of us already have that as a dependency, so we can skip that step. And then MongoDB is telling us to use this string to establish connection. Now, I have already pre-drafted the code that we're going to use to establish connection with MongoDB and connect to the database and retrieve the data, simply because when I did try to sort of live code it, it was really painful, and I want to avoid you all the pain of watching me struggle with this. So I'm going to go to the repo that we keep referring to, if I can find it. I don't have it up. Right, I'm going to pull it up now. Because like I keep saying, the application that we are working on, it does have a repo that we can use as a guidance. And if you scroll to pretty much the very bottom, I think it's step number 3 on aim number 3. No, sorry, step number 8 on aim number 3, yeah. I'm just going to grab that code so I don't have to write it out, but I will run through it just to make sure we all know what it's doing. I am so lost in all of these tabs. Again, I'm going to comment out the getStaticProps that we worked on just now, and I'm just going to paste that code. Again, it's step number 8 from aim number 3. So in terms of what this block of code does, the first 2 lines establish connection with MongoDB. And I have used the string that has been provided to me by MongoDB, this one right here. But obviously I had to amend it so it includes my credentials, so we are making sure we are connecting to the right database. And again, because we are working on the server and we are working with Node, I can use the process key to access my environment variables. And the way you manage your environment variables in Next.js is inside of this next.config.js file. So you can see that inside of this file, by the way, I will delete that database after this, but here it is for the moment. I have the env object, and all of the keys inside of it are my environmental variables that I can use in this project. So, which tab is it again? Oh, I don't need to change tabs. I'm just losing my head at this stage. So the first 2 lines, like I said, we're just establishing a connection with MongoDB. I just realized that I need to import Mongo client, otherwise it's going to moan at me. And I'm also going to comment out these 2. I'm trying to scroll, I promise. So once we have established connection with MongoDB, we can then connect to the database, and this is what is represented on line 46. Then the next thing we need to do is we need to connect to the collection that holds our data. And in MongoDB, collection is basically a way for you to categorize your data in your database. So I currently only have one collection, and it's called meetups. And inside of that collection, I'm just holding all of the data about my meetups. But if, for example, my application had the capability of allowing people to create an account, then I may create a new collection called users, and that's where I would store all the information about my users. But in order for us to grab data from that collection, we firstly need to establish connection, which is what is happening on line 48. And once that connection has been established, we can then go ahead and grab the data. And in this case, I am grabbing all of the data from that collection, and I'm turning it into an array so I can work with it. And then lastly, I'm closing the connection to my database. So now that I have all of my events, again, I need to filter them in the same way we filtered the events when we were reading the file. So I'm just going to create a new variable. Called featured events. And that's going to be equal to events filter event. And once we have our featured events, we can now go ahead and return an object like before with a key of props and featured events. Now that we've done that, let's see what happens. You can see that we are getting this error. And I deliberately want to flag this error because it allowed me to learn something about React components that I think is worth flagging. So this error is essentially saying that the data that I am returning from my React server component isn't capable of being serialized into JSON, and therefore it cannot be passed to my homepage component. Now, the reason why Next.js has problem with any data that is not capable of being serialized into JSON is because when we are passing that data from the server into a regular React component, that data is being passed, it's being formatted into, it sort of looks like JSON, but it's not. It's like a special format that the React team has come up with. But clearly, it has to be capable of being serialized into JSON in order for us to be able to pass it. And the reason why the data that I am currently returning right here isn't capable of being serialized into JSON is because of the way MongoDB assigns IDs by default. So if I pull up data now, oh, it's going to be close because everyone's using it. It's going to be slow. You can see here that every time I inserted some information or a document into my MongoDB database, MongoDB automatically added this /ID key, and it's equal to some object ID. And it's that field that isn't capable of being serialized into JSON, which is why I'm getting this error. So the way to, obviously, to fix it is to map over each of the featured events and then return all of the keys as they are, except for the ID key, which we want to turn into a string just to make sure that we can serialize it into JSON once it's returned. Again, I am going to copy the code that I have already written for this because there is a lot of spelling in here and you don't want to see me do that. I just need to amend a little bit here. So all of you should have access to this return statement that you can just paste in. Remember, you do have to change the variables though, because I forgot to update it, sorry. And essentially, like I said, all I've done here is I'm firstly mapping over each event inside of featured events. And then for each event, I am returning every single key with exactly the same value, except for the ID key, which I am turning to a string using a JavaScript method. Make sure to refresh your page when you go back to your application after you've done that, because it flags an error otherwise for some reason. And now we can see that our landing page has bread in it, which is a good sign because it means that we have read that data, we have pre-generated that data, but we have grabbed that data directly from a database during that pre-generation. Cool, so that is all that I wanted to show you today. However, I will conclude by saying that, is anyone still coding away?
Just a few things about the
I'll wait. No problem. Just follow along. Did you get the bread? Yay! It's a lot of carbs. Oh, I was going to tell you, it's going to be. How are you doing?
that should say speech.
Don't worry.
You've got it right. All events. That's what we end up with.
All good? Is it the variable names confusion? I'm sorry, I can only apologise. I only tried to trick you there, just make sure you're listening. I'm just going to conclude, and then after the conclusion, anyone that's still coding, I'm more than happy to help. But I just wanted to say lastly, before we break off, that whether or not you want to use Next.js, or maybe not Next.js, but whether or not you want to use React server components depends on your use case. So just because we now have React server components doesn't mean that rendering data on the client is not valid and we should always render data on the server. Everything depends on what is it that you are trying to do. So for example, if I wanted to build an internal application and none of the data within that application would be visible until I log in as a user, then I probably don't really care about search engine optimization because none of the data is visible to the search crawlers regardless whether I render it on the server or not. So in that case, it will be absolutely fine to just render that data on the client. And similarly, I probably wouldn't really care about the load time as much in an internal application because I'm not trying to sell something to someone where I have to worry about whether they're going to change their mind about buying my product. So again, client-side rendering, sort of slower load time wouldn't really be an issue. And also you can always pick and choose for each page whether you want to pre-render it on the server or whether you want to render it on the client. And all of it, again, depends what is it that this page is trying to achieve. So if I give you an example of this application, I'm just going to close this because we don't need to look at it. I definitely want this landing page and all of these featured events to be pre-generated because I want the search crawlers to see the information about my featured events. But if I go to this page, I still want this page to be pre-generated, the all events. I want all of these events to be visible to search crawlers. But as soon as I start filtering and I'm taken to this page, I probably don't really care that much about this page being pre-generated because that data is already visible to search crawlers in the previous pages. And I don't really care about the load time as much because if you're someone who's looking for a DevOps event and you're going to the length of filtering this data on my all events page, the chances are you're not going to be put off if it takes a second longer to load this page. So if I were to build this application, I would probably leave this particular page rendering on the client side. So you can just pick and choose depending what is it that you're trying to achieve. So that is it. That is all I wanted to show you today. So I don't know what just happened. There should be a slide at the end saying that you can now ask any questions, but it has disappeared. Oh, here it is. There you go. What is it doing? Right, anyway, if you have any questions, please fire away.
Nothing online.
Any questions from anyone? It's okay if you don't have any.
So my question is really regarding to the performance of the server itself. So if it's a high traffic website and we're doing the rendering on the server, so we need maybe more powerful server to handle the requests, or is it the same? Or
Yeah, so for this, in the last hour, I haven't really talked about server-side rendering. I talked about pre-generating a page on the server at build time. So your question is more sort of aimed at what happens in the life cycle later on that I haven't covered. But you're absolutely right, yeah, you have to pick your server depending on what your expectation of the traffic is. But it's more to do with server-side rendering, and you wouldn't be using getStaticProps. Potentially, you could be using getStaticProps if you're revalidating your page. But yeah, it's not really a concern that I would have for a static application like the one that I've worked on today. But yeah, a good question nonetheless. Anything else?
Such a good question that I'm posting it on YouTube.
Oh God.
Because just in case anyone didn't hear it, it's a really valid question, isn't it?
Thanks, Phil, because I did forget to repeat after you told me several times, so make sure I don't forget. Right, so we're going to break off if no one has any questions, but I will stick around for a bit of time if you do have any questions since then.